agree that there's so much possibility, potential, and power at your fingertips when you're young? I think I personally agree. Just Google songs with the word young in the title and you'll find a ton of old people still trying to be young. Why? Because there's a power that only the young have. It might not always feel like the truth, but it is. Just think about the power that only the young people in society have. Teenagers and young adults influence what music and movies top the charts and win awards. On top of that, consider this. Your generation spends $143 trillion a year, which means that you have a massive influence on the way that companies are creating, marketing, and selling products. It was people close to your age participating in sit-ins during the civil rights movement in 1960s. And teenagers were advocating to end gun violence in schools today. Louis Braille was only 15 when he invented Braille. That's a lot of power. And as Uncle Ben told Peter Parker, just so you know, that's a Spider-Man thing, in case you were lost. With great power comes great responsibility. But come on, you already know this. In fact, some of us feel it every day. You know deep down that being young gives you a ton of potential and lays out so many possibilities for you. You've heard for years that you can change the world. And why have you heard it? Because it's true, whether you feel it or not. Now think about your faith. When it comes to faith, some of us are being underestimated. When it comes to the idea of church and what it means to live out a real faith, some of us feel like the low expectation is to just show up, is underestimating our potential. Others of us feel a different way. We don't feel underestimated, we feel overwhelmed by the pressure when it comes to faith. And here's what I mean. Maybe the pressure to show up feels like a lot to you and you feel guilty when you can't be there. Maybe you feel a lot of pressure to follow all the rules, and when you mess up, you feel like you're not allowed to call yourself a Christian. Maybe you feel like being a Christian is actually a huge burden instead of something that brings joy to your life.
When you're young, every other area of life can feel so full of possibility and power, but sometimes our idea of faith can feel so basic. It kind of feels like this. You've seen one of these before, right? This is a bike pump with a pressure gauge built into it. So basically, when you're pumping up a tire on a bike like this, there's a number, it's called the max PSI number, right? And I know it sounds really, really scientific, but basically it means the pressure per square inch. Scientific, but it's just a number that you aim for when you're adding air to the tire and you watch the pressure gauge go up. It's exactly the amount of air that the tire needs to work like it was created to work. See, when you're filling up the tire and the gauge shows you that you haven't reached the max PSI number, if you stop there, then the tire will be flat or soft and you won't get the most out of it. And if you push way past the max PSI number and add too much air pressure, then eventually the tire will explode. Like, hopefully not when you're riding the bike, that would be catastrophic. I mean, you probably get the point, right? The same thing happens in our lives, especially when it comes to faith. At times, the pressure gauge connected to our lives shows that we could actually handle more to truly be at our best. Not more pressure, but more responsibility, more room to own our own faith, more help following Jesus every day. At other times, it feels like the gauge is way past our max PSI number. It feels like if we are given any more rules to follow or any more standards to have to live up to, we will eventually explode. Or at least we'll get so worn out by the pressure that it might not feel like faith is worth doing anymore, right? Is Christianity just supposed to be a life of pressure being put on us by other people? Or is it something that we can take ownership of, just like young people have done with so many other things throughout history that have wound up actually changing the world? Can faith be bigger and better than the basic version that we feel pressured to fit into?
Well, there is one person in particular who lived a couple of thousand years ago who could definitely relate to being a young person trying to figure out their own faith. This dude's name was Timothy, and he was a young leader in the early Christian church. He was young, like a lot younger than the people that he hung around with. Thankfully, he had an incredible mentor in his life. His name was Paul. Paul was one of the most influential people to ever live. What's cool is that Paul would actually write Timothy to encourage him and give him advice. And we get to read these letters because they're a part of the Bible. It's called 1st and 2nd Timothy. There is one part of the letter that I imagine meant so much to Timothy, and it can have a big importance on us today. Check out what Paul wrote to this young friend of his. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, conduct, and love, and faith, and in purity. Put yourself in young Timothy's shoes. If it was his job to tell older people in the church what they could and couldn't do, it was his job to tell people with much more life experience what choices were wise and what choices were not. Oh, imagine the expectations people had of Timothy. Timothy was far too young for leadership. How old would you have to be a leader? What would you feel if you were in his position and people were thinking this? And Paul, the top dog of the day, he said, no, Timothy's valid. Don't let other people tell you what you can and cannot do. Do not tell them that you're less than you are. Instead, Paul tells Timothy to be an example for them. Lead the way in all important areas. Set that bar high for yourself so that you're setting the bar even higher for them. Timothy, you are their example. Paul told Timothy to set an example in the way he talked, he behaved, in the way he loved people, in the way of trusting God, in the way of living with healthy boundaries. All of these examples had something in common. They show us that Paul saw something in Timothy. And in his second letter to him, he explains a bit of what he saw. Look at what he wrote. He said, I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now that it lives in you also. Paul recognized that Timothy had a great example of faith in his life, like his mom, his grandma, that Timothy had also a genuine faith that was all his own. See, whether he was being underestimated by others or overwhelmed by misplaced pressure, Timothy understood that his faith was something only he could own. Yes, it may have started as a copy, but one day it eventually became his own. This kind of ownership changed his life forever. He didn't have to pay attention to the pressures that other people were putting on him because he had a faith of his own, and he owned his faith, meaning that he took faith personally and he took steps to strengthen it. This can be your story too. There is a chance that when it comes to faith, up until this point, you've either felt underestimated or overwhelmed. You felt the pressures that other people have put on you in ways that have caused your faith to either feel too basic or too much for you to handle. Either way, we learned from the words of Paul that you can own your own faith. You are not meant to let the pressure or the lack of expectations from other people define the way that you relate to God. Just like young people don't wait for permission to change the world, you don't have to wait for permission to make your faith your own. You can follow the example of Jesus, do the things that he did, become more like him regardless or whether or not you feel underestimated or overwhelmed right now. Here's what this can look like. If you're feeling underestimated when it comes to your faith journey, here are a few steps that you can take to own that faith. First, explore what you believe in. This means you should ask questions that you've always had. You should think of yourself and not just take my word. Anyone else should not influence you. You should dive into that book called the Bible. Second, move to an everyday faith. Here's what I mean. It's easy to get in the habit of a Sunday faith, where we act like this at church on Sundays and we act like this with our friends. But what if we acted like we do on Sundays? Every day of the week, we served, we loved, we helped everybody around us. We made that faith our own. Maybe you can start an everyday faith, and it could look like spending time with God daily. The third thing is invite others in. Explore with other people. Ask your small group leader for resources to help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. Ask hard questions and get answers, but figure it out together, or figure it out on your own, or figure it out with God through his word. Just based off what older people tell you is not the way to live. You need to find out for yourself. You need to dive in the book. If it feels like a possibility, you're probably on the right track. As you live out all that it is to be young, don't forget that you can own your faith. During these years of your life, you have the opportunity to set a tone for the rest of your life with the way that you practice your faith. Imagine if your journey with Jesus wasn't based off of someone else's basic faith. It was based off a true, authentic, daily relationship with Him. Faith isn't always easy, but following Jesus is full of possibilities. Imagine as a high schooler, you began to own your faith and experience life to the fullest like Jesus promised you. One day you won't be young, so don't forget the unique opportunity that you have right now. You have everything within your grasp. This week, let's think about one question. When it comes to faith, have you felt underestimated or overwhelmed?